Hello everyone and welcome to another Pawn Endgame lesson with Coach P from MasterChess.com. In this video, we're going to talk about the topic of undermining. To fully understand this lesson, you need to have knowledge about the square of the pawn, self-protecting pawns, and the floating square. If you're not familiar with those lessons, I encourage you to watch those lessons first. I will put a link in the description with videos that cover those lessons. Assuming that you know those topics, let's get started. Sometimes pawns are too strong to be attacked by the king. In such cases, many times, undermining can be used successfully. And if you're wondering what undermining refers to, it's simply breaking the pawn structure of your opponent until you're able to overcome it. So in this first position, it's white to move, and if we analyze this position, we can see that the black king is tied to the defense of the self-protecting pawns on e5 and g6. However, black has a passed pawn on d4 that's protected by the pawn on c5. Even though white is winning here, the win is not that trivial. After something like king to e4, king to e7, white cannot just go and attack the pawn on c5. If he goes after the pawn on c5, the pawn on d4 will promote. For example, if white makes the mistake of moving the king to d5, well, now he's outside of the square of the pawn on d4 and he's not going to be able to capture it. Coming back, what white needs to do here in order to win the game is break black's pawn structure with the pawns on a2 and b3. What he needs to do first is retreat the king to d3, after king to e6, king to c2, king to e7, king to b2, king to e6, and now white can start breaking black's pawn structure. So here, pawn to a3. Black needs to take the pawn on a3 here, because if he allows white to move the pawn to a4, then he's going to have two passed pawns and the black king will not be able to hold on to this position. So after b takes on e3, king takes a3. Here black cannot march his passed pawn on the d file with pawn to d3, as the white king will get inside the square of the pawn and he's going to be able to capture it. Coming back, better is simply to wait with king to e7. And now white needs to be careful. He cannot push the pawn to b4 right away. This will be a terrible mistake, because here black doesn't need to capture the pawn right away, which will give white the win. But here he's going to march the pawn to d3. And white needs to get inside the square of the pawn with king to b3. And now is the time for black to capture on b4. And if you look at this position now, black has reached a self-protecting pawn scenario, where white cannot capture the pawn on b4 as the other pawn will promote. Coming back, all he can do now is retreat with king to b2, and he simply needs to stay on the squares b2 and b3 and accept the draw. After king to e6, if he's trying to attack the further advanced pawn with king to c1, he's going to lose this game, because after pawn to b3, black reached a floating square that reaches the edge of the board, and white has lost the game. After something like king to d2, the pawn will march to b2, making a wall with the pawn on d3, and white is totally lost. If he takes the pawn on d3, black will promote, winning the game. So coming back, after pawn to a3, b takes a3 and king takes a3, and king to e7, here white needs to retreat with his king and break black's pawn structure still. So the correct move here is moving the king to b2. After king to e6, king to c2, king to e7, king to d3, king to e6, and now is the time to break black's pawn structure, as the pawn on the d file cannot move forward. So after b4, black has to capture, c takes b4, and after white captures the pawn on the d file, he's also going to be able to capture the pawn on the b file, and then bringing the king over to fight together with the self-protecting pawns, he's going to win this game. In this next position, it's white to move, and he has a winning endgame. However, winning is not that easy. Black's pawns on f5 and g5 create a wall together, making it difficult for the white king to attack them. If he tries to go around that wall, let's say king to e3, he's going to have a little bit of trouble. Even though black is not going to be able to stop him by taking the opposition with king to e5, as white's pawn on the b file will promote, white still cannot go around the wall to attack the pawn on the 5th rank. You might think that the pawn on the h file is simply stopped by the pawn on g2, as he cannot march on h3, and white should be able to go and capture those pawns. But let's see what happens. So after king to e3 and king to c6, here white needs to play pawn to a5 to prevent black from capturing the pawn on b6. And now the black king is stuck defending those pawns. After something like king to b7, if white makes the mistakes of going after the pawn on the 5th rank, thinking that the pawn on the h file is blocked by the pawn on g2, he's going to lose this game. After king to d4, black is going to play pawn to g4. And now white is totally lost. If he tries to go after the pawn on the 5th rank, let's say king to e5, black will now move the pawn to h3, and white cannot prevent him from winning. If white takes on h3, then after g takes h3, white cannot get into the square of the pawn and the black's pawn will promote. And coming back, retreating the king will also be too late. After pawn to h2, the white king will not be able to prevent the other pawn from promoting. So coming back, after king to d4 and pawn to g4, I do want to mention that no better is retreating the king now with king to e3. Even here, black can still play pawn to h3. After g takes h3, g takes h3. If white will get inside the square of the pawn with king to f3 to catch the pawn on the h file from promoting, black is able to move the pawn to f4, creating a wall together with the pawn on the h file, and white is totally lost. He cannot make any progress on the left side, as moving the pawn to a6 will simply be captured by black's king, which he's going to be able to take both of the pawns. His pawn on f2 is stuck, and now his king cannot move anywhere. If he tries to retreat king to e2, then black will simply march the pawn to promotion. So coming back, we saw that moving the king to d4 is not going to help. The way to win here is simply retreat the king with king to e2, and then try to undermine black's pawn structure. So after something like king to a6, king to f1, king to b7, king to g1, king to a6, king to h2, king to b7, king to h3, blocking the pawn on the h file. If black here tries pawn to g4 check, this is not going to work. White can simply capture on h4, and now he's going to be able to capture both pawns on f5 and g4. After something like king to a6, white is simply going to go and capture both of the pawns, winning the game. Coming back, if instead of moving pawn to g4, black is simply going to wait, let's say king to a6, well now white can play pawn to f4. We saw that pawn to g4 is not going to work, as white is going to be able to capture all of the pawns. And coming back, if black does take the pawn on f4, here after king takes h4, pawn to f3, g takes f3, white is still going to be able to capture the other pawn, winning the game. Coming back from the beginning, I also want to mention that there is another way of winning. Instead of moving the king around the pawns to h3 and then breaking black's pawn structure, he can also move here with pawn to f3. And after this, I'm just going to fast forward to the moves to see how he can win in this variation as well. And after white captures the pawn on the right side, he's going to be able to bring his king together with the connected passed pawns, winning the game. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video. And again, I encourage you to go on my website, masterchess.com, where you'll be able to practice these positions against the computer. All you have to do is click on Endgame versus Computer, Pawn Endgames, and then Undermining. And here, you will be able to play against the computer. If you like my videos, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, share, comment, and like my content. Thank you and have a great day.